I'm Rod Goodyear, and I'm a partner in the Practice Institute and an emeritus professor at both University of Southern California and University of Redlands.
And I'm Amy Ellis. I'm also a partner at the Practice Institute. I'm an assistant professor at Nova Southeastern University and the director of the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program, also at Nova.
And we're privileged today to have a conversation with Gerald Davison, who's professor of both psychology and gerontology at the University of Southern California. Jerry's a noted scholar. He's made really substantive contributions, more than 150 publications, including his book with Marv Goldfried, Clinical Behavior Therapy, which the Social Science Citation Index recognizes as a citation classic. Past president of APA Division 12, Clinical Psychology. Past president of the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. Distinguished founding fellow and certified supervisor of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, the 2003 recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. And I was reading this today, Jerry, that Radiolab apparently accorded you as one of the 6 cardinal bishops of behavior therapy, which I thought was a really nice mantle to wear. So we're really pleased to have you with us. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so happy to have you. I really enjoyed the upcoming Netflix documentary that's coming out titled Conversion. I think it's coming out in end of April. So it's a story of the evolution of your thinking about the ethics of treating LGBTQ plus folks, particularly gay men. And it really culminated in your 1976 article, which was based off of your presidential speech. In a major journal. I know that there's some commentaries written about it as well. We'll get into that. But for that work, you had received the 1988 Outstanding Achievement Award from APA's Board of Social and Ethical Responsibility. It's a beautiful story, I have to say. It's one that's very near and dear to me, as well as members of our community. And it just really encapsulates the experience of the field, the politics, the times itself. So welcome, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Rod. So I can talk about the development of my thinking, which is described in the film that'll be available on Netflix, I'm told, end of April, called Conversion. And Chuck Silverstein and I are sort of the quote unquote stars of this film. And it's a story of how I changed from the behavior therapist who was interested in and working in changing sexual orientation. It was primarily with gay men, and then running into Chuck more or less almost but really by accident at an AABT convention. It was called AABT at the time, and how I had an epiphany through Chuck's arguments, and then came to regard what I'd been doing and what my colleagues were doing as morally and politically wrong. And it was a, as I look back on my work with helping people change from gay to straight, I'm frankly mortified and embarrassed by what I was involved in. But I learned from that and changed to a position where I felt that it was politically incorrect to do so and morally incorrect to do so, quite aside from whether it's possible to do so. Some people don't make that distinction. It's vital to make that distinction. I don't happen to think it's possible, but that's almost beside the point. It's a question of what people should do is not always what we can do. I try to make that distinction. So I came into behavior therapy early on when I learned from Lazarus and Bandura, were two of my mentors in graduate school at Stanford. And it was really the development of behavior therapy through Bandura and Michel at that time in the early mid-1960s that I came into clinical psychology because I saw in behavior therapy a way to be scientific about what we do as clinicians. And that was really was a revelation to me. Not something, seems a simple enough notion, but it's not something that I'd learned as an undergraduate. And one of the things that I got into was developing ways to help people change their way of being sexual, if you will, from gay to straight. And there was an interlude there of, how I actually came about to get into the procedure that I developed, which was a more positive conditioning procedure and not aversive. It was working on enhancing sexual interest and arousal to a particular set of, heterosexual stimuli, if you will, and rather than aversion therapy, which was discouraging by one or another kind of punishment. So in that sense, I thought that I was sort of one of the quote unquote good guys. And I think that I was, in terms of it, at least I wasn't punishing people for it. But I was, aside from the fact that I wasn't having much success clinically, I was involved in an enterprise that was embedded in 100 years, at least 1,000 years long biases against homosexuality. And I hadn't given it a whole lot of thought. In particular, I hadn't given much thought to whether people, quote, seeking change were really making anything that would approach a voluntary, uninformed decision. And like most people at that time, I was asking the client who came to me for this kind of intervention, are you sure you want to do it? Are you comfortable with leaving what you are now towards heterosexuality? Oh, yes, they assured me. And I suspect that in their heart of hearts, they really felt that way. But I was overlooking the societal oppression that was getting them basically to want to change. That's the part I was overlooking. And that was the element that Chuck Silverstein opened my eyes to at a convention, 1972 AABT convention in New York City at the New York Hilton. And it was through a symposium that he was chairing where he himself was being zapped by his gay activist colleagues for even having a convention presentation that entailed dialogue with the quote unquote the enemy. And behavior therapists were very much the enemy, but we're often given a bad rap for that. The real enemy, in my mind, were the psychoanalytically oriented people who were who avowedly regarded it as a deviation. It was embedded in their theory, and it was articulated primarily by Irving Bieber and Charles Socarides. And they were the two people who were basically not so basic. They called it sick and deviant and not good and caused by a constellation of deviant parental constellation at home. The sort of over dominating, the close binding intimate mother is Bieber's phrase, I think, and the distant father. And they felt that was pathogenic. Anyhow, attending Chuck's symposium and hearing him make the argument very eloquently really got me to thinking. And literally I was leaning this way anyway, I suspect, I don't know, but I was certainly open to the arguments that the gay activist people were making, that, this is a legitimate way of life, a way of being. And it was on my way home from the Hilton to where I was living in Port Jefferson at the time. I was teaching at Stony Brook, that I really had an epiphany. That was a sudden realization that, the gay radicals who were lambasting behavior therapists, among other people, and the analysts in particular, that they were right. They were right and we were wrong. And I had been identified with this trend in behavior therapy to concentrate on altering people's sexual orientation, that, I had this change of heart. And when I went to Stony Brook, literally the following day, I began to talk to people about, what we're doing is wrong. And the reaction I was getting from the students was one of interest and acceptance of this. That makes sense. The faculty, entirely the opposite. It was a very combination of hostility and worried about my reputation from people I was very close to, both personally and intellectually. But at this time, and this is the other part of the story that's important, I had just become president-elect of the Association for Advancement of Behavior Therapy. And part of being president-elect was being president and then becoming a past president. And when one became a past president, one gave a presidential speech at the convention, and mine was going to be in 1974. So I had a couple of years to think about, well, what am I going to give for my speech? And this revelation, this epiphany I had about how I'd been wrong, began to germinate in my mind that this would be an interesting speech and possibly an important and influential one to give. I really have a platform. And so I began to put together my arguments on this, drawing very heavily from Chuck, because he was the that turned the lever in my head, so to speak, and other colleagues like Dave Bagelman, and there were a couple of other colleagues. And I developed this argument, gave the speech. All of this, by the way, this story is discussed in the film. And that, as it had been initially discussed, by the way, in this Radiolab podcast, someone quoted me as one of the cardinal bishops of behavior therapy. That's rather, let's say it's rather generous, but it's nice to have a compliment. And I, in this podcast where I talked about this, came out in November, I think, of 2018, that told the story, and it told a biographical story, my upbringing, my background, personal, professional, and so forth. And it was heard by a documentarian named Greg Caruso here in Santa Monica, nearby where I live. He was very moved by this podcast. And he emailed me and he said, I think this would make a marvelous documentary that I'd like to make, and I'd like you to be in it. And would you come and talk to me about it? And after checking out his credentials, and he was a bona fide young documentarian, a graduate of the film school, cinema school of cinematic arts here at USC, either one or number two in the world for training in cinema and television, writing, producing, and so forth. He was a real item. So I went and talked to him, and we hit it off personally. He's a very nice fellow, and he had 2 or 3 of his colleagues with him. And they were, what I realized sort of midway in the conversation, I think there was kind of auditioning, an audition for would I be okay on camera? Could I tell the story without too many disfluencies? And at the end of the conversation, they said, we'd like to do it. Would you like to do it? And I said, yes, but of course, Chuck Silverstein should be involved too. They started to talk to Chuck, and it ended up Chuck and I at different periods of a given day that we talked. It was in February of 2019, I think it was, that we met at a soundstage in Hollywood. It turned out to be a soundstage where the I Love Lucy series was produced, and it was sort of, people were sort of reverential about this particular sound. This is where it happened, and we were filmed, videoed, long interviews. Mine lasted 2 or 3 hours. Chuck's was in the afternoon, lasted a little bit shorter than that. Then they edited, and it went through various iterations, and it became this documentary that is now going to be available. That we each of us talked about how we came to this realization. Chuck was very personally a gay man at a time that it was much harder to be out of the closet than it is now. Not that it's not challenging, depending, of course, on part of the country you're living in. And for me, it came from the professional part, and through the influence of readings in the gay literature. I should mention, if I can go back a little bit, when I said that the state, I'd been sort of prepared to change my mind on this. What happened is around that time, and I think it preceded my being exposed to Chuck's ideas at the ABT meeting, I had been teaching a graduate elective seminar at Stony Brook called Homosexuality. And that was the title of the seminar. Chuck was very interested in this. It was through the readings in the gay activist literature, it was around then that I think I must have been changing my point of view. This is as best I can recall it. So I think sort of the ground had been laid for the real switch to be clicked in my head about, and in my heart about, what I've been doing since graduate school, since Stanford. So we met. We had this filming, and I thought it went very well. And the film was produced, and it's been in what they say post-production for quite a while. I didn't realize how so much of the work happens after the people, the actors, if you will, do their thing. So it's taken a while to get into now to be distributed, and I'd been permitted by the producer to allow select people, as I did with you two, to look at a earlier version of the film, which I believe you've both seen. So let me just pause now and sort of been yakking for a while, and maybe you can ask some questions and I can say some more about the whole thing.
I can listen to you all day, so there's no yakking whatsoever.
I'm mindful of the currents of change that were churning at that point. So the American Psychiatric Association had taken a stand to no longer recognize homosexuality as a mental disorder, and I think 1973. So it sounded like your personal revelations were occurring at about the same time. There were other movements afoot in the fields, and I'm wondering how you juxtaposed those, connected with it, or was this one of those things where you had your epiphanies and then only later looked around to see that other people were kind of marching in the same direction?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, Rod, because and Chuck was very much involved in getting the American Psychiatric Association to drop it, but they really didn't. Their solution was a phony solution, and I think it was fraudulent. Frankly, they had a category for about 8 or 9 years where they made this big thing about we're dropping homosexuality. They didn't. They had a category called. First was called sexual orientation disturbance, and that became ego dystonic homosexuality. What it was that people who were gay and were bothered by it, they were still sick. So if you're gay and you're bothered by it, you have a mental disorder, by definition, according to them. So they didn't really change on that, and it is correct that they did make a major shift with a lot of controversy. By the way, ABT, when I was president, made the shift actually before they did. But being a small organization, it not as well known.
In the reading I've been doing, it turns out you're the one who wrote that resolution.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I wrote that resolution, and I got a lot of resistance from the board of directors. There was people were very unhappy with it. This wasn't, by the way, a resolution on ending conversion therapy. There's this is a resolution of it's not a mental illness, and there was nothing in there about. But it is if you're uncomfortable. We didn't say anything about that. The other APA did. The little APA, American Psychiatric. We didn't deal with the conversion part. What I said to the board, I remember after one of the meetings we were having, where we decided to have the membership voice their opinion as to we're thinking of making this policy. What do you think about it? And people agreed. It was simply to drop it as not to call it a mental disorder, but a normal variation. I forget how we phrased it. One of the people after the board meeting where I've been making the argument, and quite frankly, twisting arms. I mean, there was no question that I was twisting. I was quite obnoxious about it, frankly. I was a lot younger, and I mean, as they say, full of piss and vinegar. I still am to some extent, but I was very much so in those days. I think you saw me when I was beginning to mellow, Rod, when we were colleagues at USC, but I was very much not very tolerant to people who had a point of view that I thought was incorrect. That's the way it was. I don't, that's, I think, what one does when one's young. I think that's good. I was, during the break, someone said, well, I hope you're satisfied kind of thing. And I said, halfway, you ain't seen nothing yet, because I was beginning to write my speech.
Wow.
And they said, what do you mean? I said, I'm still working on it. Come to my presidential speech in November '74, and you'll hear it. So I had time to work on it, and I'll say a few things. Let me mention one thing about, on a personal note. Chuck and I became friends, and good colleagues, friends, and I told him what I was planning to do, and I think I may have given him an earlier draft or whatever. And in my argument, I was taking a community psychology position. Basically, I was saying we got to look at it at a larger level, not just individual therapy. We're going to look at societal pressure, and as clinicians, we have to take this point of view. We're doing it all the time. We're not really mindful of it. We do it in a lot of things. Non-assertiveness. What is non-assertive? You're not expressing your rights. What are your rights? Who defines rights? We get into issues of sexism as well, but I didn't want to get too much into that. I wanted to keep it focused on homosexuality. And Chuck said, he came out, I think he gave a talk at Stony Brook, and we were having lunch or dinner at one of my favorite restaurants in Port Jefferson, at the Elk Hotel restaurant, great seafood. And I remember Chuck saying, and this is in the film, he cautioned me about it. He said, I'm really glad you're doing this. I'm glad for any role that I played in it. She, of course, did. But he warned me that if I came out, if you will, and said no more conversion, that one of two things or both would happen. One is people would think I'm gay. Second, my reputation professionally would be harmed. And my answer was, it's irrelevant to me. Number one, I don't happen to be gay, but that's beside the point. And I didn't care if people thought that that's why I was doing it, because I was gay, but I'm not. And that's irrelevant. That's a way for people to discount your position. That's where I felt it would enhance my potential influence, that I wasn't doing it for personal reasons. On the professional front, I had a pretty good reputation at the time for a young fellow, and I said, I don't care. I don't think it will matter, but I'll get over it. It was irrelevant to me. And he said, fine, as long as you know, because he was saying this as a friend. He said, as long as you know that's a risk that you run. I said, absolutely willing to run that risk. And to what extent those two things happen, I'll never know, actually. Not that I went out to find out. I don't think my reputation was harmed. And as it turned out, if anything, it got enhanced, because what's happened since I gave the talk in '74, I was part of this movement to not only not regard it as abnormal anymore, and not do that half step that the other APA did. They finally did come around. Maybe was it 1980 or
1980 with DSM-3. Yeah.
DSM-3, and that was great. That was great, and I'm glad that they did, and I'm glad to have played any role in that. But it's what's happened since then, I must say, is beyond my expectations. I didn't think things would change so fast. I mean, when you consider from 1980, or however you want to say, 75, to when states began to pass laws discouraging conversion therapy, at least among younger people. I'm not so sure where it stands with people who are not adults. I'm not sure. It's a little ambiguous to whether they're coming flat out. Do you know, Amy?
Yeah, it seems as though it is against the law, but you still can do it through religious institutions and camps, etc. So it can still be done. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's very unfortunate, because it's the religious institutions that I think have caused the problem in large measure. All religions, all of them, and now some of them are making adjustments, but the more orthodox one been virulently discriminatory against homosexuality. Now it's in the both an Old and New Testament for one thing. I don't know about the Quran, but I don't think it's looked on very kindly in Islam. But for this change to have taken place in, maybe 25 years, I didn't expect it to happen that fast. It's wonderful that it's happened. To me, it says something about society being ready for something, and there being enough people who were thinking this way anyway, and that there was a sort of a critical mass who were enabled to see what I was emphasizing, that you have to look at the whole society thing. And that's where you should direct your change. You see, I made the argument that you shouldn't offer these sexually orientation programs, even when people ask for them. It's even when they ask for them. Now, that's a very hard position to take. And some of my very good friends got very angry with me. Like, why are you denying they didn't use the word fascist, but it fits sort of. It's people have a right to choose whatever. I said, yeah, right, they do, but is it really a voluntary choice? And I believe that the data on frequency of requests for change, showing how it's plummeted in the past 25 years, data like that, those data indicate that what I was saying was correct, that it was, once you remove the societal pressures to, that once you say, society really shouldn't be doing this, laws change, whatever, people think, I don't have to be this way, and they can be more gay affirmative and have more of a sense of themselves as that this is me, this is fine, and that it's become much more widespread and much more a topic of conversation. We remember, we think back, those of us old enough to remember when Ellen DeGeneres came out and she came out in her role as Ellen on the program. I mean, it was one of the most hilarious, actually, program. I mean, she is just hilarious anyway. I can't look at her without chuckling. She's just a funny person and very personable. I don't know if you remember, she was, it was Laura Linney, I think, was the actress, and they were at an airport. And she was coming out to Laura Linney, the character Laura Linney was playing, and she was very uneasy about it. And they happened to be in front of a microphone on a PA system in the airport. Yeah. And she leaned over into the mic and said, "I'm gay." And it resonated through the whole airport.
Oh my God, I hadn't heard that story.
Oh, it's hilarious. It's hilarious. Well, her career was hurt. Ellen's career was hurt, Ellen DeGeneres, and she came back brilliantly.
Oh, yes, she did. We have to think about what it means for the times that was even on TV, right? So, I mean, to your credit, there's been so much change that's occurred over these past, 30, 40 years. It's amazing. I mean, when I was hearing you talk about kind of, it surpassed everything, and Chuck turns to you and says, "Hey, this is career suicide. There's going to be this rumor mill that comes around you." I just kept thinking to myself, you are by definition what an ally is. An ally is someone who uses their privilege and their power that you had as being past president and kind of the command of that room with 1,000 people in there during your presidential speech and publishing it. That is what we look for, right? Someone who can speak for folks who are burdened by discrimination and stigmatization and minority stress. And that's chutzpah. I mean, that was taking so much of a risk with your own self, personally and professionally. That it's a true role model, I think, for what we look for. So.
Yes, and in fact, the award that I received from APA, I think it was a subdivision of the Board of Social Ethical Responsibility. It's since, I think, become a separate division. Talked about me as an ally, and that is very, very, very gratifying. I won the Hooker Award from APA, I think in 2010, and I think ally is in the wording of that award. So It is a very powerful. A powerful word, and that And it is, in fact, very, very gratifying. Let me tell you about the problems I had publishing that paper. This is discussed in the film also. True story. I was around 75, I think. I think I was visiting that year at Harvard on a fellowship. I submitted it to American Psychologist because I figured all APA members get it with your dues, and we get wide circulation. And it was rejected without being reviewed. It wasn't even sent out for review. And the reason is the editor said it's not of general enough interest. Think of that for a minute. What a stupid thing to say. Quite aside from whether the merits of the paper, what a silly thing to say. And so I got very angry, and then I laughed. And I said, if we'd had email, then I might have sat down and wrote him an email, and then I would have edited it because I would have, didn't want to be insulting, but I would have said, this is a really bad decision you're making, because it may be totally wrong, but it's certainly not. It certainly is of general interest. So then I submitted the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, and I happened to be at Harvard at the time, and Brendan Marr was editor at the time of JCCP, and also chaired the department at the time. And so Brendan, I sent the thing to him, and he must have called me on the phone, and he said that he's not going to send it out for review. And I thought, oh, not again. And he said, I'm not going to send it out for review. I'm going to accept it outright because it's so important. And I thought, wow, how lovely. Not, the fact that I have admired Brendan Marr for years. He was, by the way, the inspiration for my writing the Abnormal Psych book with John Neal that came out in 74, interestingly enough, the same year I gave my speech. And so I admired this man greatly. But he said, but would you allow me to send it out for commentary, critiques? And I said, absolutely, that's great. He said, would you suggest some? So I suggested that someone who would love it and someone who would hate it. So I figured Irving Bieber would hate it. I said, Bieber should definitely be a person to send it out to. In the film, I misspoke. I said I thought it might have been Socarides. I'm pretty sure it was Bieber. Then Seymour Halleck, who I was always influenced by, wrote a wonderful book that no one reads called The Politics of Therapy. I think it came out in 72. A short book. People ought to read it. It's a marvelous book on the political aspects of clinical interventions. I was strongly influenced by that, and he was heavily cited in my paper. And then I forget I think Alan Bergen might have written one, and there might have been a fourth. I can't remember who else. To my surprise, Halleck's response was supportive, but he didn't quite. I was basically articulating his argument. We have to be political about it.
Right.
And he was uncomfortable with that, it seemed to me. So that was a little disappointing. Bieber, predictably, he just came after me, and he was gentlemanly about it, but he basically said it was totally mistaken, and the implication was that it was dangerous. I don't think he used that term, but it was not a good that I was making this point of view. So it came out as a lead article issue in 1976. My article, based on my address, 74, and then the commentaries, and it got quite a bit of attention that way. I know lead articles, as you know, are very good. It's lovely if you get published in your first article in that issue of the journal. But that was the story of how it got published. It got rejected by APA from somebody who was editor, who was not a person of great scholarship. It's not like this person was a well-known person in the field. He was not. And it was largely, I think it was edited, it was sort of part of the political apparatus at APA, not so much the scholarly. Still, I regret that it wasn't published. I wish it had been published at APA, but that says something about the times. His judgment on it was the majority view at that time, the overwhelming majority that, well, this is wrong. Why he thought it was not of general enough interest, that that surprises me. I don't know how he came to that conclusion. Anyway, that's another little part of the story.
I mean, I think that just your discussion of the politics, I think that's one to really hone in on it, in terms of, I think especially nowadays, we have very divided politics in our nation. And I've heard a lot of trainees and psychologists say we have to be apolitical, we have to be neutral. And I think that this really reminds us that that is a dangerous territory to be in, because we're going to be on the wrong side of history when that occurs. It's not surprising to me that an editor, I mean, to me, it's smoke and mirrors. It's not really that it wouldn't have been of great interest. It's just a fear of, if we publish this, what will happen to me? Will they come for me in the same way, or how will we deal with this? And I think that's the risk you take when you do advocacy. So I appreciate kind of that rallying cry of no, we do have to be political, both understanding that and conceptualizing and working with our clients. But I would also argue outside of the therapy room. I don't think it's enough to just support and advocate in the room, but really, whether it's legislature and changing policies, whether it's publishing, whether it's educate, there's so much more that we need to do in order to be true allies and create change. I think that's part of why the change was created so quickly.
Yes, I agree. I would say that the reason Seymour Halleck's book was so profound, so influential, and so important is that everything's political that we do. It's that we cannot help but be political. What the DSM structure does, it medicalizes what Thomas Saz called problems in living. Now, he took a very extreme position against mental illness in toto, but the idea that we're just sort of treating illnesses that are out there that have nothing to do with social mores and cultural differences, whatever, is foolhardy. I think it's and dangerous. Yeah. And I think that, yes, there are problems that we can have agreement on. This is an illness. People ought to be helped, one thing or another. But what, particularly in outpatient treatment, when not in institutions, most of us are walk around with a walking wounded, if you will. The people who are unhappy, they're anxious, they're depressed. Problems in living. I love that phrase of Thomas Saz. We're not getting along. And these are things that are impossible, I think, to look at outside of the social context. We're beginning to do so and being better at it when we're being more mindful of, more aware. Mindful's got another term these days. We're being aware of sensitive to the cultural factors, subcultural, to diversity in the field. And that's where what I was, in a way, what I was talking about back then in the mid 70s really is in the current context, comes under the general rubric of diversity and equity and inclusion. I think DEI, I think that's something that is very important and that represents all sorts of groups. By the way, the thing about, how can I kind of phrase this? In some one of the papers I've written on this is plastic surgery. Now, plastic surgery is for aspects, it's cosmetic surgery now, not the kind to when you've got faces messed up in an accident and you want to put your face together. It's getting Asian women getting their eyes enlarged. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, Jewish girls, as a matter of course, were getting their noses fixed. Jewish boys didn't as much because it was okay for a guy to have a big nose, but not for a girl to have a big nose. Think about that for a minute. What's wrong with a big nose, for crying out loud? Yeah. It's you got a deviated septum. That's a medical thing. It's the girls, the young girls. And I use that phrase with all due respect. They were not women yet. They were young, very young women getting their noses fixed because it was too big, because it was regarded as bad to have for a girl, young woman to have a bump in her nose. Okay for a guy. Now it's extended, especially in LA, in this town, the neck, the cheekbones. You can get your cheekbones made more prominent, get a tummy tuck, whatever, you get a butt raised or whatever. These are surgeries that it's impossible to look at outside of a social context. Yeah, absolutely impossible. And the fact that, the fact that men are having it done more and catching up, if you will, with women, it's sort of like, it reminds me of women catching up with men with regard to cigarette smoking. Is this, that's no great,
Right.
don't emulate me for that. That's not such a great characteristic to want more of. So, but again, the main thing is the social and political context. I think it operates in the sanctity, if you will, of the confidential relationship between therapist and patient. And in most of what we do, the way we define problems, the way we decide not just what procedures we will use, but what goals we would, the goals of therapy, more so even than the means of intervention.
Jerry, you said that when your work first started in this area, the students were very receptive, and it was your colleagues who were less so. And yet there's some students who aren't quite there yet, or maybe adamantly not there. And I guess I'm kind of shifting to a training focus now. How have you responded to that over the years as a professor training clinicians?
That's a very good question, Gerard. And there've been some court cases on this. I forget, blocking now on the name of the woman who was at a religious college, and she got, I think, bumped from her training program. Mm-hmm. I forget the particulars. It had to do with whether she would refer somebody who wanted sexual orientation change. I don't refer, by the way, in the early days. Now it'd be hard to do a referral, but when I was into this in the 70s, my position was I won't refer. And I think I once asked Chuck, would he refer? And I think his answer was yes. And my answer was, why? Why would you do that? But I'm not sure what his position would be now. By the way, Silverstein, if you can get him for this series, he's marvelous. I mean, he's hilarious. He's smart, can be very sarcastic, but always with a twinkle in his eyes. Anyway, he's a great guy. As you'll see in this film, he gets away with profanity in ways that I
loved it. I loved it. He's like, grab him by the balls. So I was like, okay, all right.
He got away with, what is it? Shithead, asshole, whatever, calling Bieber or soccer. I refrain from quite that. Let me mention one other thing. After I gave my talk at the convention in '72, it was this big hall. I was nervous as hell, by the way, very nervous. And I tape recorded it because I wanted to hear it afterwards and hear how I sounded, even though I had a script. Well, after the talk, I think it wasn't enthusiastic applause. It was polite applause, but they didn't throw stones at me, whatever. These were my people. This was a good group, the behavior therapy group. I was one of them. After the speech, people, sometimes you give it to people come forward, and the folks who came forward, about half a dozen younger people, and at least half of them were crying. And it's hard to talk about without tearing up right now, is that they said, I can't believe what I heard. I can't believe what you said. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I thought, thank you, for telling me that. That means a lot. So then I went outside. By this time, there was a reception area outside the ballroom where people were having drinks and canapes and kibitzing, whatever. I went out into the area, and my recollection, and this is portrayed in the film with a cartoon character sort of, is that people were backing away from me. It was very funny. It was sort of, not sure what to say, but they weren't being overly hostile. One person, a colleague, close colleague, came up to me. I'm not going to mention his name. And he shook my hand, and he was taller than me. He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. And I knew exactly what he was doing. And I knew that he wasn't gay. I don't think he was gay. I don't know whether maybe he was one of those who thought that I might be gay, but he was giving me a kiss in the cheek. And I said, either fuck you or screw you to him. And that was the end of that. I mean, I thought that was a shitty thing to do, but I get what you're doing, screw you. And after that, I just fell in conversation with other people, and then went home. And by the way, the speech was completely ignored, totally ignored by the psychology community, by the press, by the media. Totally, it was like it never happened. It was very interesting. No one was interested in it. There were a couple of interviews. One guy at Newsday, his name was John Cashman. He did an interview, but nobody else was interested. It wasn't picked up. Which, be that as it may, ABCT didn't have much of a press office or much of a media presence. If it had been one of the APAs, I'm sure it would have been. But as I said, as we all agree, it's over a relatively short period of time, the ideas became, it was part of the not the mainstream. It's become the mainstream. It wasn't at the time, but it was part of this movement that was developing at the time, not from the scientists, not from the professionals. I played a role in the professionals, taking some role in that, but largely from the gay activists who were saying, I'm not going to put up with this shit anymore. And they were zapping. That's discussed and discussed in a very funny way in the film. That was the technique. I was the object of zapping. I got zapped more than once in some presentations that I gave before this this presentation. One other thing I'll mention, I made a film, by the way, before my conversion to the right way of thinking, the right way of thinking, with my good friend Bob Liebert at Stony Brook. I made it, I think, around must have been 1970, 71 at Stony Brook. And it with an actor, graduate student actor, there are clips of the film shown in conversion in the film that's be released on Netflix, that I'm embarrassed by. I watched that film now. I'm showing the kind of conversation you'd have towards what we call Playboy therapy. It's sexual reorientation, a sort of positive reconditioning, if you will. To watch that film is painful to me now. And I, in fact, the documentarian wanted to get a copy of the film to incorporate it in his film. And I said, you really have to do this. He said, Jerry, it's part of the story. Would you agree that it's part of the story? I said, yes, but I don't think that way anymore. He said, I know that, but that's why it's part of the story. Anyway, the film was shown at an APA meeting in Montreal around, I don't remember, 73 or 74. I can't remember when. Or 75, maybe later. I'd already changed my mind on this. But the film was being shown by APA as part of its film program, and I had no control over it. I don't recall if I contacted someone and said, I'd rather you not show it. I sort of let it go. Anyway, it got shown. I went to the showing of it. And most of the people in the audience, I think, were gay activists at APA. And they were screaming at the film. They were screaming at it. And I wanted to scream at it too. It's terrible. And then afterwards, I forget how it happened. I don't recall if Chuck was involved in this, but a few of us ended up going into some park. I think it was in Montreal, it's a public park, and sitting and having a conversation. And I explained to the gay psychologists who were at the convention, among those who were screaming at the film, how I changed my mind. And they said, well, good for you. I said, well, yes. I mean, I had changed my mind, but you agree it's a terrible film? I said, yes. And I wouldn't even think of making it today. But this was before my change in my epiphany, my change in point of view. But that's sort of, a little anecdote about, doesn't show up in journals, of actually part of my journey and is sort of part of the negative legacy, if you will, because for a while I was identified with that film, and that, that's sort of, it is what it is. That's what it was, and that's the way it happened. It was distributed. I don't recall who the distributor. Psychological Cinema Register, I think, was a distributor of the film. I don't know if anyone even watches it anymore. Anyhow, that's part of the record too.
So we talked about doing a half-hour interview. We're pushing an hour now. So I mean, it's just such a great conversation. Is there anything that we should have thought to ask you that we didn't as we start to wrap this up?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't. Well, in terms of training and students, so you actually
yes.
that question. And I didn't answer it, so I'll try to answer it now. Most, in my experience, students buy into this enlightened point of view, if you will, very easily. They're there already. It's part of the culture, especially in higher education circles, which is the circles they've traveled in. If this is a war or a battle, it's far from one. Far, I think, and I tell people this: most people in this country vehemently disagree with this point of view, violently disagree with it, and we're seeing it, as if Trump hadn't unearthed stuff. It's part of the rhetoric. They have so many other people to rail against, namely, principally Jews and Blacks and Democrats. So it's prevalent, I think, widespread, more so than we who work in university settings, particularly in the geography we are in. Well, I won't say Florida. Florida has lots of its right wing, as you know, Amy. But in Miami, for example, and Chicago and LA, New York, Boston, perhaps to some extent, most other places, I don't know how widespread the point of view is, but the enlightened point of view is, I'm sure in different pockets, but there are parts of the country where I'm sure it's a lot more difficult for folks to come out as gay than it is in the parts of the country we happen to live in. But Florida is an interesting case in point. What is it like there? I mean, I know what it's like there from your governor and other stuff, but yeah,
that's a good glimpse. Well, it's funny, like, as we're talking about training, you're right. Like, so you're in graduate training, it's a doctoral program. I think it's fairly liberal. We're right outside of Wilton Manors, which is a big hub for LGBTQI plus individuals. But I'm actually astonished by the number of students who don't think that this is a more systemic, institutionalized, politicized issue. And so it's almost like you can get the buy-in of, yeah, okay, LGBTQ, that's okay, we can accept that, just like heterosexual and, cisgender and trans. Okay, cool. But once you get to the point of trying to pin it on these broader contextual variables, it actually breaks down. So, I mean, Florida ends up being a hub where everyone else comes. So I actually think we're a nice representation of the rest of the country, because nobody's really from Florida. You're from somewhere else. New York, born and raised, just for the record. So I think that it demonstrates, we've got some movement where you can now be out, and that's not so much the aspect that's frowned upon. But it's when you start saying, I'm in distress, not because of my LGBTQI status, but because of society, because of rules, because of laws, because of other people, because of discrimination. I think cis het folks tend to struggle with that part of it.
I think that clinical and counseling psychology in general has to be more like social work in the sense of getting a more societal perspective. I think we're getting better at it. Community psychology and psychology, that started in the Kennedy era in the 50s and 60s, and has an interesting sort of history. One of the things that's left out, I think, in talking about that part of psychology is the values part and the cultural part and the mores and the ethics. Most people think about rent strikes and poor people, very important issues. But the more general issue is the way society is structured. This is what students, they have to know this. And I agree with you, Amy, they're not as oriented towards this. For one thing, their embrace, and even in our program, the total embrace of the DSM. I think that there's value there, but that's not taking a broad societal perspective, I don't think. I mean,
Right.
it's gotten better, but
It's not taught. I think that's the issue. I like to think that in my training, I've completely turned folks off from the DSM. It's something we have to do. We can fight it. Then also, we have to kind of abide by it. But it's not taught. We don't teach that. In no psychopathology class that I ever took did anyone give me the historical context of it. This is all stuff I've discovered after the fact. And so, you just take it like it's Kool-Aid, and you accept, okay, this is what it is. And it's funny when you were talking about kind of the evolution of homosexuality in the DSM, we relived that with gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, right? So we had that in there, and that was the same thing as homosexuality. Here it is, it's pathological. Oh, wait, nope, now we're going to change it to gender dysphoria, which just means that it's ego dystonic. And now we're trying to get that changed. So we haven't learned from our mistakes because we're not generalizing the lessons learned. We just keep making them over and over again, a product of society.
Yeah. Things change slowly, and students are under multiple pressures. They get supervised a lot in our program anyway, off campus, and these are older. They're going to be older than they are, and they're living in a different world, and they have to fill out the DSM because reimbursement issues and
Right.
this and that, and so the thinking gets sort of channeled this way. It's understandable, but the function in a university setting is supposed to be to take broader perspectives, to take unpopular points of view, explore them, and make adjustments, maybe find them wanting. But I'm just going back to my Stony Brook experience. It's so vivid to me that the students were so much more receptive to it than my colleagues. My colleagues, to a person, were don't do it. This is terrible. This is awful. I had a very good friend, very distinguished friend, not at Stony Brook, who at a meeting got very angry, and he very seldom got angry. And he said, I was going to be responsible for an increase in suicides. And I said, do you have any idea of the suicides that are caused by the pressures that gay people have towards what they are, who they are? Don't you think there are suicides there too? Do you care about those suicides? No, he wasn't thinking about it. He was thinking about, I'm denying people, and they're going to be oppressed because they're not straight. And I said, that's the point. Indeed, they're oppressed because they're not straight. We agree. No, that's not what I meant. I said, well, you're not taking that point of view. He came around. It took a while, but he came around. It takes a while. People get vested. We as psychologists should understand this from attitude formation and so forth. It's changing beliefs systems is very difficult to do. Okay, my friends.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jerry.
Okay, both of you. Take care.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.